All right, well, we are back in the shop. Finally, I feel like I haven't been out here forever. We've had so many projects going on, house projects, the shop projects that you saw in the past couple of videos, building a road to the shop. I've had so much stuff going on with work and travel and everything else, and not to mention that these gears took like over a month to show up, but they are finally here. We have our Nitro 4.88 gears, we have our ARB air lockers, and now we can finish up the gear and locker install on the Land Cruiser and get this thing back on the road. So we have our ARB air lockers here. We're using the RD132 and the RD142 air lockers, front and rear. We have the Nitro Gear 488 package here, which came with the front and rear ring and pinion and the setup kits and solid pinion spacers for both as well, which will be nice. Make sure we don't knock those things on a rock and toss our preload out of whack. So this will be the first time I've ever installed an ARB air locker. Now, I have done plenty of gear and locker installs and other lockers in the past, but never an ARB air locker. So we'll see how this goes. I'll try to be as verbose as possible to get this like documented very clearly. And yeah, hopefully everything goes well.
Before I get started with the gear install, I'm gonna clean up the differential housing because I absolutely hate gear oil, and overall just working with messy parts, it just bugs me. This front diff also had a bad pinion seal, so this thing was covered in gear oil buildup and just overall nastiness that's been collecting over the years, and it's gonna be much easier if we're working with clean parts rather than dirty parts.
All right, so the first thing that I'm gonna do is just take a file and very lightly take off any potential high spots or anything that would interfere with the mounting surface when this goes onto the carrier. I would also normally have this out in the sun just to slightly expand itself so that it slips on that carrier a little bit easier. But it's not a sunny day, so that's not gonna happen. And as you can see here, this thing is machined pretty flat as it is, so I think we're gonna be good slipping this thing right onto the carrier.
Sometimes these ring gears are very tight, sometimes they literally drop right on even without heat, and sometimes they're just like an average to moderate install. I think it really depends on the kind of gears you buy, like what company you buy them from, and what your carrier is, if it's OEM or if it's ARB or if it's Yukon or if it's something else. But in this case, I didn't even really need to use the heat gun. After this thing cooled off, I was still able to rotate it to get the ring gear bolts installed, and that's really the hardest thing. Once you drop the ring gear onto the carrier, you have to align those bolts. So typically at this point, after I get the ring gear installed, I move to the carrier bearings, and you can see what I'm doing here. I'm rotating the bearing as I'm pressing it, and I'm pressing from the inside of the bearing, never on the actual bearing cage itself. And I'm rotating it just to make sure that nothing's binding as I'm pressing this thing on. And overall, if you have access to a press, this part is very easy to do. You just toss it in the press, use some sort of pressing tool like this pipe that I have here, and press the bearings on. Now for torquing the ring gear bolts down, one of the things that you can do is just clamp the entire assembly into a press to the point where it can't turn anymore, and then tighten the bolts down that way like I'm doing here. But what I've done in the past for lockers that aren't selectable, so think of a spool or a Yukon Grizzly or something like that, you can just toss them directly onto an old axle shaft, put it in a tire so it's like sticking up in the air, drop the carrier on it and tighten it that way, and it'll hold it perfectly in place the entire time.
Well, we got the ring gear installed, all the bolts torqued down, 75 foot-pounds. I went 4 pounds higher than factory spec, and we have the bearings pressed on. And now we have to get to the scariest part, which is drilling and tapping for the bulkhead port. Now, one of the things that it says here is to mark and drill in this location, but what you have to realize is on an 80 series, this is a reverse high pinion. So if you drill over here, where it says to, you're going to be drilling a hole on the bottom of your diff. So if you're doing the same job, make sure you drill on top of the diff. And what I've done here is I've loosely set the pinion in there and loosely set the carrier here just to kind of see where my pinion is going to be and where my ring gear is going to be. And I've determined that probably the best spot to drill is going to be right here. Now, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but there's actually like a little recessed spot here where it looks like maybe it's a plug where the E-locker would put its wires through. And that would end up right here, which would put it kind of in line with this bolt hole. and I don't want to have to fight with a wrench when I could just use a ratchet and a socket. So I'm going to kind of just maybe offset it here to the left a little bit. And yeah, we're going to send it. This is this is kind of scary.
All right, well, drilling the hole for the bulkhead was a nerve-wracking experience to say the least, but overall it went pretty well. So now I'm installing the pinion races into the differential housing, and on these reverse rotation Toyota diffs, there's an oil retainer that can be easily forgotten to be reinstalled once you're at this step. So just to make sure that you don't forget to install this. I don't really know how much of an issue it would make if you didn't, but it's supposed to be there, so let's get it installed. And one trick you can do to help install races is put them in the freezer prior to installation. However, my outer race dropped right in after I froze it, and it concerned me so much that I actually took it back out and installed it again at outside temp just to make sure that it had some resistance while installing it. I mean, if it didn't, we'd have to use a retaining compound to keep it in place, because a race isn't just supposed to drop in this sense. Luckily though, it did take force to get it back in while it wasn't frozen, so I guess that's proof that freezing parts works.
So at this point, we have the carrier all put together with the ring gear. We have the actual housing itself drilled and tapped for the bulkhead fitting, and we have the races installed for the pinion. So now we have to get to the tedious part. And I mean, everything with gear installs is tedious. It's not like it's just a point A, point B kind of thing. You don't just put it together and get away with it. Sometimes you might. But most of the time, you have to tear these differentials apart over and over and over again until they're the exact spec that you need them to be. So what we have to do now is set our pinion depth. So I have my old pinion right here, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but there is a shim in between the head of the pinion and this bearing right here. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take out that shim and put it onto my new pinion, press my new bearing on, and then roughly toss together this whole assembly. And by roughly, what I mean is we're just going to have bearings on there. We're not gonna have the solid spacer and the pinion seal and all that stuff, because we're probably gonna have to take this all back apart. So what this is gonna allow us to do is it's gonna allow us to check our gear pattern, and we have to do that before we can move forward.
I always like to start with the factory pinion shim because most of the time you end up pretty close to where you need to be. It would be a lot more difficult to just start with an arbitrary value and work from there unless you're just a very lucky person. So in my opinion, starting with a factory shim is the easiest way to get in the general range of where you're probably going to be. We have the factory shim installed on the new pinion, and we're pressing on the new bearing. And as you can see, I have had the pinion in the freezer, and it's still a fight to install this bearing. Sometimes these things can be really tight, but I'm still spinning that bearing just to make sure that nothing's binding and we can get this thing installed without any issues. At this point, the pinion is ready to be installed, and I know of two ways to do this without using special tools, and I actually use both methods in this video. So the one we're going to use right now involves a hammer. You can use a dead blow, a mallet, or some kind of soft hammer while you're holding the pinion to strike the pinion flange far enough down onto the pinion itself to then install the nut and sandwich everything together, because these bearings are a press fit. They don't just slide over that pinion. And the other method would be to use a press. Either way, you're still going to have to tighten the nut a little bit against that flange to sandwich everything together, which I don't like to do, but as long as you keep everything lubricated, I've never had an issue with stripping threads on a pinion shaft. For the initial gear pattern check, we want to mimic how the diff will be set up once it's finished. So that means that we want to set the backlash to what we would set it to if we were finished with the job. We want to set the pinion preload to around what we would set it to if we were finished with the job. So typically, once the pinion flange is seated, I'll tighten that nut until I feel what I think is around 10 to 15 inch-pounds. And you could also check that with an inch-pound torque wrench, just to be sure.
So as you guys saw, it looks like we're gonna have to grind down that pinion. The manual wants at least 20 thousandths of clearance in there, so for right now we can at least probably check our gear pattern. So I'm gonna install these adjuster rings right here. The way I like to do this is without the actual caps on. I like to do it first by threading them in place and then setting the caps down. And then the ARB unit came with 2 different adjuster rings. I don't know why. I guess it's to cater to different models, but the one that fits the Land Cruiser is this one. So that's the one we're gonna use. This slips over this little standoff on the carrier right here. And I'm just gonna get this thing in place and then get these caps on. And we should be good to go. Also, these caps are directional. They have to go on the side they came off of. They are not interchangeable. So if you have it all threaded up correctly on the adjuster nuts, these will go on with no effort like that one did right there. These should not be hard to push on. Never force them with the bolts. They should just go right on just like that. Perfectly. Another way to tell that you have these aligned properly is that you'll be able to tighten these bolts by hand. You won't have to force it with a ratchet or anything like that. These will not tighten down properly if this cap is not aligned perfectly to the carrier. So that's how you know you have the cap in line with the carrier and the adjuster in line with both.
The sound you're hearing is the backlash, or in other words, the gap between the teeth of the ring gear and the pinion, or you could just call it the play. Setting the backlash properly is something that we have to do if we want our gears to mesh together smoothly and operate as they're supposed to. Luckily, adjusting them on Toyotas is as easy as turning an adjusting ring. In other differentials, you have to actually pull out the carrier and change shims every single time just to adjust the backlash. Between 6 and 8 thousandths is what I'm looking for here, and now we can check our gear pattern. Gear packages come with marking compound that is typically yellow, and to check how the gears are meshing, we'll paint a couple teeth and then spin the diff around. It is important to apply some drag here, and what I prefer is to push my leg up against the pinion flange while turning the ring gear. And unfortunately, like I predicted, we did not get lucky on our first go around, but we are close. This exact pattern you see here, the pinion is too deep. So we do have to go completely backward now, reverse all the steps, take off the bearing caps, pull the carrier back out, press the bearing back off of the pinion, choose a different shim, put everything back together, reinstall the carrier, reinstall the pinion. All that stuff has to happen all over again. Then we check the pattern again, and hopefully next time we'll have more luck.
It's the next day and I'm about to toss the carrier back into the third member housing. I got the pinion reinstalled last night and we're gonna check that gear pattern again. Now I think the pattern was a little bit too deep. If you look at this example right here, you can see that the upside down like frowning face in the coast and the drive, it's an indicator of the pattern being too deep. So I went from 82.5 thousandths all the way down to 76.7 thousandths. So we're down about 6 thousandths of an inch and we're gonna see what the pattern looks like now.
With everything back together, we can check our gear pattern again, and this time I was using my hands instead of a wrench to spin the ring gear. I don't know why, and it doesn't really matter. We just have to make sure that we apply drag while we are spinning the gears together. And this time our gear pattern is looking much, much better than before. Look at the face to flank compared to before, how much more centered we are and how we aren't so deep into the root of that tooth. Now, you may have noticed that the drive side was favoring toe, and that doesn't matter as much. We don't have as much control to change that dimension as we do changing face to flank. And to be even more sure, I contacted Zuck, who is widely regarded as the Toyota gear expert, and he gave me the green light on this pattern as well. So we got lucky, we nailed it on the second try, and now we can move forward, start grinding this pinion away to fit with the ARB.
Well, hopefully I took enough meat off that thing. I guess we won't know until we toss it back in with the carrier. But what I have to do now is set up the solid pinion spacer. So this right here is different than what would be in here stock. Stock, these would have a crush sleeve, and a crush sleeve looks like this guy right here. And basically what these do, both the solid pinion spacer and the crush sleeve, is they set the preload in between your inner and your outer pinion bearing. The difference is that the solid spacer is a static dimension. It's always going to be exactly what you set it as, whereas the crush sleeve, as the name implies, crushes as you tighten down this pinion nut. So you tighten this thing down super tight, it would crush this. Once you get to your right preload, you stop, you stake it, and you're done. This is a much better solution for an off-road rig, because if you were to hit your pinion flange, you might crush a crush sleeve more. This could never move. It's a solid piece of metal. It's never going to move. The problem that I'm running into, though, is that if you look inside of the Land Cruiser differential here, you have this little oil retainer, and what that looks like, I bought 3 of them because I knew I would mess one of these up potentially, but they look like this. And what's happening is when this slips over the pinion, it does not clear the spacer enough to allow the pinion to fully seat. So you can see the spacer does have that lip right there, which I assume is a provision for something like this, but it's not quite enough. So I think I could flare this out if I use a seal driver on the inside, just push it up this way. If not, I did call Yoda Masters. They said they take these out of their diffs, so we'll see if we can get it to work. If not, we'll just toss it out, I guess. I had to take it apart, but what you can see here is this is a factory oil retainer, and this is my one that I just flared. You can see the inside flare lip on that one, where this one is flat. I just used a seal driver and then kind of hammered it in there, and that allowed me to get this flare. You see this one doesn't go as far in, of course, and I think that this lip that I just made should give me the clearance to run a solid pinion spacer. So to test this, I'm going to take the pinion, stick it into the bottom of the third member, and push it all the way up into that bearing race. I can feel that it bottomed out the bearing on the race, and when I spin this thing around, maybe you can see that, maybe you can't, but now there's clearance in between that retainer and the solid spacer. So we're ready to reinstall this pinion and see if our shims, right there up on top, are the right size for the pinion preload. I just got the pinion reinstalled into the third member, and we already have a little bit of preload here, just basically not being tight. So I'm gonna set this thing to about 100 foot-pounds, and we'll start with 75 just to see if this thing has way too much preload, which I think it's going to. So I'm not going to tighten it all the way because we don't need to if it already has too much preload at 75 foot-pounds, and we're going to tighten this thing to like 100, 150. So let's go ahead and tighten this thing up and see where we're at. Okay, that's 75 foot-pounds. You know what? It actually feels pretty good. So we're going to set this thing to 120 foot-pounds. Now, I don't know what the exact torque spec is for a solid spacer inside of a Land Cruiser differential, but I'm gonna assume something around 120 to 150 is probably fine. You're not gonna strip the threads off of this nut unless you go absolutely crazy on this thing, so we're probably gonna be fine. We'll set it to 120. Okay, there's 120. Preload honestly feels pretty good. Well, I'm not sure how well you guys can see this, but we have about 6 inch-pounds of rolling preload, and our starting preload is actually really high. So you'll see here, it's about 30 before it starts going, maybe 25, 26. And that's a lot higher than what the manual wants. The manual is looking for new bearings between 8.7 and 13.9, and for the international viewers, 0.9 to 1.6 Newton meters, I believe is what that is. It's a lot easier to read, I'll give you guys that. So I think we might have a lubrication issue just based off of how notchy this is to start. So I'm gonna try to knock off this pinion flange, add some more lube to this bearing here, because obviously I can get the bearing that's on the inside, and see if we can get this value to be a little bit more acceptable. And if not, then I guess we gotta pop it all back apart and change out the shims.
Unfortunately, it was not a lubrication issue and the preload was still too high on our second go around. So as I said, this process can be very tedious. Everything has to be taken back apart. We have to change out those solid spacer shims and then toss everything back together and see where we're at.
All right, got everything back together with the new shim, which is 53.8 thousandths, and we are looking good. You can see here the starting preload in between 12 and 14, so we could imagine 13-ish inch-pounds. The rolling preload looks to be about 3 to 4. It's always been interesting to me how you're measuring starting preload and not rolling preload, but I mean, I would feel like the rolling preload would be more important, but compared to other thirds that I've set up for Toyotas, this feels about right. Not notchy, not too hard to start it. Really nice, smooth movement on the preload of these bearings. And we used this Michitoyo Quantum mic. This thing's accurate to 1/2 of a tenth. I'm guessing. There's 5 zeros. It's very, very accurate. So we were able to take these shims and find the smallest of the bunch that said they were 10 thousandths and then toss it on here, because otherwise it would have been around 54.5 thou, which definitely would have been too loose. And right now we'll just check it one more time. I believe we are looking good. So once again, yep, right between 12 and 14 to get it rolling. And the rolling preload, really hard to see. It's about 4. And if we take a look at the manual over here, I just want to show you guys this because I find it interesting. I wonder if you're in the same headspace that I am. To this point in the manual, it's telling you right now to remove the differential case, which is just what our locker and our ring gear is. It's out at this point. They toss the pinion in there. They tighten it without a spacer because they're using a crush sleeve. So they tighten it in there temporarily with new bearings just to get the preload set before they check a gear pattern. And it's saying for new bearings, 8.7 to 13.9 inch-pounds. And then it goes on and says to reassemble everything and check the preload. And this is for a used bearing, but for a new bearing, get it to 8.7 to 13.9 inch-pounds for the whole assembly. When you toss everything in there, of course, it's going to take a little bit more to get it going. So I don't know. I would expect 20 or something. And to be honest, I don't typically check it again after I set the pinion preload. So I think we're ready to go ahead and toss the carrier back in and check the gear pattern one more time. I got the carrier reinstalled, the backlash set to around 7 thousandths, and I just ran a final paint check, and everything is checking out good. As you guys can see, nothing has really changed with our pattern. We still have that really good pattern from earlier, which is what we expected, but I just want to be sure before we toss everything back together. Oh, and let me show you what the reverse painted side looks like as well. So right there, and not sure how well you'll be able to see the coast. Yeah, you can see it well. So we're getting good engagement on this. Our pinion depth is good. Our pinion preload is good. Our backlash is good. Now what I have to do is just finish up the pinion side. So remember, this does not have a seal in it, and it doesn't have an oil slinger. And that's because I wanted to just do one more gear pattern check. So we're going to have to take our 27 spline slinger and enlarge this hole because it fits over a 27 spline, but it will not fit over a 29 spline. So some quick work with a grinder to get that all cleared up, and we'll be able to fit that in here, finish up the pinion end, toss this thing together, do a leak test, and we'll be good. Well, before I get this thing put back together, I want to get all of the nuts and bolts and the hardware clean. I used to have an ultrasonic cleaner that worked great for that, and it fell apart. And as luck would have it, this company called Eway or Away has reached out with impeccable timing to send me a new 6-liter ultrasonic cleaner. So let's go ahead and try this thing out and see if we can get all of the nuts and bolts for our differential nice and clean. All right, let's see what we got inside here. We are gonna have the actual, I don't want to call it a cart, it's called a bin, a washing bin for the parts to go in. We have the drain tube and we have the power cord. Now this particular unit, it has a heating element as well, and that'll help us clean even better. So let's get some water in here, toss in some super clean as our cleaning agent, and see how clean we can get these bolts. Got the ultrasonic cleaner propped up on my Home Depot bucket here. You gotta do what you gotta do when you're in the process of building out your shop. All of your tables are taken up and you don't have power. So we're running an extension cord to this thing like we always do. Let's turn the power on and let's set up the heating element. We're gonna put this thing, oh, it's in Fahrenheit. We're gonna put it to, let's say 130. So right there, we heard an audible click. Heating element is on as indicated by that light. We're gonna toss in some super clean as the cleaning solution here, and just let this thing heat up and then toss in our hardware. So I have all this hardware to get clean. I'm gonna start off with the bolts that hold on the carrier bearing caps and my front drive shaft bolts, because I keep using these to hold on this flange onto my pinion, and I'm tired of getting my hands dirty on them. So I'm gonna toss these in there and all these bolts just to start off with, and we'll see how clean we can get them. This solution's starting to get pretty warm. I can feel it, so I think we're ready to go. So I'm just gonna drop this in there. Ouch, yeah, it's hot. And then I guess we'll just dump this in there because, yeah, that was not cold. Okay, put the cap on. Set a timer here, we'll do 20 minutes and turn this thing to max. Let's see, I have to look. Yeah, look at all the stuff coming off of the bolts. All that cloudy, black, murky stuff is all the grease. So we'll come back in 20 minutes and see what we got. Just about to finish. Let's go ahead and manually shut this thing off and see what our nuts and bolts look like. Don't have two hands, so I'm gonna try to do my best here without tipping this thing over. It wants to tip over, hold on. All right, so as we can see here, we got a bunch of nice clean bolts, taking the coating off a couple of those, or maybe that's just paint because you can still see that zinc coating or whatever that is under there. But overall, way cleaner than when we started. Excellent tool to use in the shop to get things clean, and glad I have another ultrasonic cleaner. So if you guys are interested in an ultrasonic cleaner, I do have a discount code RMGarage. I'll put a link in the description below, or you can go there yourself and type in that same code to get the 10% discount. Let's go ahead and hop back into the gear install.
With the solid spacers shimmed properly, luckily now we don't have to knock the pinion out anymore, but I do have to install the oil slinger and the seal still. The slinger will have to be clearance to fit around a 29 spline pinion, and then after that, I just have to install the seal, the pinion flange, and torque and stake the nut down, and we'll be done with the pinion setup.
I'm not going to use the seal that came with the setup kit. This is a Yukon seal that comes with the Nitro gear kits. I'm going to use this Trail Safe seal from Trail Gear instead. This is a copy of the Marlin Eco Seal. And I like that these have this raised section here. They have a better spring, and they just allow you to drive it in perfectly flush. So that's why I like to use these. And I have the inside all greased up so that we're not going to knock off the spring while we drive this thing in, and then we'll be good on the pinion side. Well, it's been about a week since I recorded that last clip, and I just wanted to take a quick aside to show you guys what we've been working on out here. So we got the irrigation all done for the shop. We have about 19, 20-ish, probably more bags of weeds that we pulled out of this whole area, because when we had the road built, it created a nice defined line of where we probably should put grass or gravel or something. So we tilled all of this, mixed in nice topsoil into it, and leveled everything out with a pallet and an old piece of my fence, and now we're just watering in the grass seed. This took like 20 hours to do. It's a pretty big area, but it's gonna make the shop look really nice, having a defined parking area, defined area for a trailer, and you know, being bordered in by that grass. So just want to show you guys that. Let's get back to the gears.
This whole procedure that I'm about to go through is just to seat the carrier bearings. The Toyota manual has you do it this one way, and I'm not sure how necessary that this actually is, because I've definitely skipped this in the past and done it my own way, but for the sake of the video, I went through the process. Basically, you tighten the caps down to spec, you loosen them until they're hand tight, and then you set the backlash only using the ring side adjuster, and then you snug up the pinion side adjuster while spinning the ring gear. Once the pinion side adjuster is tight, you back it off just a little bit, and then you slowly snug it back in place while watching for movement on a dial indicator on the ring side, which would indicate that you're getting into carrier bearing preload. And then from this point, you can adjust your backlash. And you have to remember with these adjuster rings, however many notches you move one side, the other side needs to move the same amount of notches, and that's what keeps it even. Once the backlash is set, something that a lot of people skip is carrier bearing preload. And to do this, you just tighten the adjuster rings as much as you can, as long as you keep them even. So one side gets tightened, the other side gets tightened too. Sometimes you can get 3 or 4 notches, but in this case, I was only able to get 1. It was really tight. And as you can see, I cannot move this ring by riding my hand against it, and I shouldn't be able to. I have to grab the teeth in order to rock the ring back and forth, which is what we want to see here.
All right, so the main gear setup is now complete. We got the ring installed, of course, the carrier, the pinion, all the preload is set, the backlash, everything is done. Now we have to move to the ARB stuff, and the ARB stuff is what I'm more uncomfortable with. I've never done this. So this is the seal housing, and it says in the instructions here, we need to make sure the grooves in the airway are clean and free of any contaminants. Then we're gonna install the seal housing O-rings. So looks like there's 4 of them in here. Or there's 2 actually, they're just wide. And these are going to be lubricated and then installed inside of the seal housing. And then we're going to slide the seal housing onto that nub that's sticking off the side of that air locker. So I'm just checking out these seals right now to make sure there's no damage to them or anything like that. And they look pretty good. And then we're gonna look at the inside of this housing as well, make sure there's no nicks or anything that can grab and cut an O-ring. And it's looking like this thing is machined pretty well. So I'm gonna go ahead and lubricate this thing with some gear oil and insert it into that housing. Really try not to mess these up or tear them or anything. I figure gear oil is probably the best lubricant to use because that's what is going to be inside of the third member, of course. Okay. I'm trying to make sure that I don't twist these at all or do anything weird with how they're installed. We want them to be, like, see how it's twisted right there? We don't want that to be twisted like that. So push that thing in there, make sure it's flat. As you can see, that looks like it's gonna seal pretty well. So now I'm gonna do the same thing on the other one. Install this into the housing, and then we should be able to slip this onto the air locker. And this is the first time I've done this. I'm just kind of talking through it. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's that hard. It's just additional parts you're putting into your gear install that you wouldn't normally have in there. Okay, that one went in a lot easier. So see there, we have the dual O-rings installed. They're not twisted or anything like that. And yeah, let's go ahead and install this and see how it goes. Hopefully it doesn't leak. You can see in the instructions right here that it's showing that square cutout in that ring is what goes up. So once we get this thing installed, we should be putting it this way. So let's go ahead and lubricate the standoff here. I don't know what else to call it. We'll call it a standoff. Just make sure that those O-rings can slide on very easily without any issue. Gonna make sure we get the edge here
as well, because the edge can be sharp and potentially cut the O-ring. Just gonna look inside here one more time, make sure nothing's twisted. Probably put a little bit more oil in here and make sure we put it on the right way. I'm pretty sure that it should go this way. That's what it's showing in the picture, at least. This nut that's on my differential holder is kind of getting in the way of that seal housing, so I'm going to remove it real quick. And it says in the instructions, if you give it a slight twisting motion when you're installing it, it can help it go on. I'm going to put a little bit more lubricant on that. It looks kind of dry on the edge. Oh, there it goes. Just slid that one on. Okay, and then for this next one, make sure that the side of that lip doesn't get swept up by this collar here. I think we just do the same thing. All right, twist that thing into position, and it feels like it went on with no issues there. Guess we'll know once we leak test it. Oh, it wasn't even on all the way. All right, now it's on all the way. Now we have to install this snap ring, and this thing kind of looks like it goes under the back of this adjuster nut on both sides, and then it snaps into the side of the seal housing to prevent this thing from spinning. Because right now this thing's free floating on this collar. So we got to get this thing in place, like that top one's in place there. Do the same thing for this bottom one. And then we'll snap it over the housing. There's an indent down here where you can get a screwdriver to pry this snap ring up and over. It should go right into the indentation on this adjuster. That doesn't seem very secure. Oh, it's not on all the way. Okay. There we go. That was some nice positive feedback from that click right there. So that's in place, and now this thing cannot rotate or turn. With the seal housing tube profiled, now I can move on to the seals. And the instructions, I mean, they're not the clearest thing in the world, and there are a ton of different seals in here. I'm assuming these are just for different things, maybe for your air compressor or crushing tube together to join it or something, but it doesn't seem to be related to this bulkhead fitting. So you can see here, it says to assemble one of the small O-rings over the top of the short length of the seal housing tube, install the brass spacer, and install the second small O-ring. And I think that is this order here. So small O-ring, brass spacer, small O-ring, and then this compression nut. And you can see in this diagram, this is the inside of the differential, this is the outside. So we have the seal housing tube, we have the O-ring, the spacer, the O-ring, and the compression nut. So we're gonna try to set this up. Hopefully, these little nicks in the tube don't affect anything. When I was pushing it through the fitting, you know, the copper is very soft. You can kind of feel it, but I think that will not affect anything. So we're gonna put it together and see how it does. Well, here is the final seal tube profile that I came up with. I made it look exactly like it does in this manual. You have to kind of look at it upside down, but you can see there is theirs and that is mine. So looks like the exact same thing. We have the compression nut in there. I didn't want to tighten that thing too tight because I didn't know if it would tear the O-rings or not. And then it said to make sure this is free floating, and the way you can do that is you can turn your pinion flange. When you turn it, this thing will go side to side. So that has been a ton of work, but I think that we're ready to put together some sort of bench test for this thing and make sure that it doesn't leak, and then we should be done. So here's how we're gonna bench test this unit. I have this 1/4 inch to 1/4 inch male coupler going into a 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch reducer going to the ARB fitting, and then I'm just gonna install this on the end of this gun here that's used to check or set tire pressure. Tire pressure gun, that's the word. And we're just gonna put that right in there, crank 90 PSI into this thing, and see if it holds. Well, we're gonna know very quickly if this thing leaks. It's not gonna take a lot to pump 90 PSI into this. Actually, let me make sure that's what this said for the bench testing. Mine's a little bit different than what they came up with right here. So it says charge with shop air until 90 PSI is reached. All right, so I have a feeling these fittings might leak. I didn't tighten them very tight, but let's just go ahead and see how this goes. It is leaking from somewhere. Oh, I can feel it leaking from right here. But I can hear the locker engage, so let me tighten up these fittings and we'll try again. Well, there's been a slight change of plans because when I removed this hose from my tire inflator here, the actual housing cracked. You can see right there on the bottom, the housing cracked. So it's not gonna work. So I got a different inflator and that one leaked too. So ended up putting this together right here. So we have here is a tank valve into a 3-way T to a gauge, and then this is a 1/4 inch coupler that's going to fasten into our adapter here. We're gonna air this thing up, and this should work. I really don't see how it wouldn't, so let's give this a shot. I think if anything does leak, it's probably gonna be something in this pressure testing contraption that I made. I really don't think I tore any seals with the locker itself, and unfortunately I do have to use this other contraption here, which is one of my broken tire inflators to inflate this because I can't find my other air chuck. But let's see if this thing holds air. All right, we're at 90 pounds exactly right there, so see if it drops down. So as you can see, we're holding 90 pounds of air pressure in the locker with my homemade tester right here. Thing's really cheap. I think it was less than like $15 or $20 to build that. So I'll put all the parts in the description on how to build one of these if you're doing something similar. A lot cheaper than the ARB unit to do the same thing. So we're holding 90 pounds, don't hear any leaks. And we can test if this is locked if we insert axle shafts into this and try to turn them the opposite ways. Obviously, if it's locked, they'll both go the same way. So let's try that out. I have a burr filled on this side of the differential, and then for this side, I have a spare axle from a 3rd Gen 4Runner, which is the same spline count, and it should go right in. I'm not gonna let this side hang because it's very heavy, but if I twist this, this side should go the same direction if we are indeed locked. And as you can see, they're both going the same way. And I can try to hold this one to make it go the other way. And as you can see, they still both spin the same way, which does mean that this axle is locked and we are still holding 90 pounds of air pressure inside the differential, or the new air locker as well. So we're good. Well, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. I did plan to get the rear locker done in this video as well, but we're out of time. I'm gonna have to do that in the next one. I might readjust or just slightly tweak how I have that airline routed. Even though it's exactly how it shows in the ARB picture, I kinda wanna get it a little bit tighter, but we're gonna let that thing hold the pressure overnight, see if it still holds it in the morning, and then toss it back in. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I hope this was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.